So I want you to just imagine a subterranean cavern for a second. But not just a normal cave. Picture one so unimaginably vast that it could literally swallow an entire 40-story skyscraper whole.
Right, which is just impossible to wrap your head around.
It really is. And picture an indoor, underground, tropical rainforest inside this cave, complete with trees reaching nearly 100 feet into the air. There's a rushing subterranean river, and monkeys navigating this limestone landscape that basically hasn't seen the surface sun in millions of years.
Yeah, it sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Exactly. But it's a very real physical place. It's called Hang Sun Ong, and it's hidden deep within the Annamite Mountains. And the thing that just completely blows my mind isn't even just the scale of it. It's the fact that this massive world-altering geographical wonder wasn't even fully explored until 2009.
Which was, what, just a little over a decade ago?
Right. It just sat there silently, entirely beneath the surface. And as I was looking at the massive stack of research and historical analysis we're diving into today, that cave felt like the ultimate metaphor for the country we're looking at.
Oh, absolutely. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
Yeah. Because with Vietnam, there is always an entirely different world operating just beneath the surface of what you think you know.
It's honestly the perfect framing for the source material we are examining today. I mean, when you start to synthesize this encyclopedic data, you're looking at millennia of dynastic history, intensely complex modern economics, and just this hyper-dense biodiversity. And you are immediately confronted with a nation that is defined by staggering dualities and, like you said, hidden depths.
Yeah, because I think the surface narrative that most people know, especially in the West, usually focuses on a country that survived some of the most brutal warfare of the 20th century.
Right, that's the immediate association for a lot of people. But beneath that, you have the architecture of a nation that systematically repelled 3 massive Mongol invasions centuries prior.
Which is wild.
It is. And they managed a really delicate absorption of ancient neighboring cultures, and then, recently executed the staggering pivot to become a hyper-modern economic powerhouse.
So the mission of this deep dive today is to really map out the mechanics of that resilience. Like, how exactly does a nation engineer that kind of survival and transformation?
And to map those mechanics, we really have to look at the foundational code of the country. And in this case, the code is literally written into the name itself.
Well, I love this part of the research. The etymology of Vietnam is this fascinating linguistic puzzle. It completely recontextualizes how you view their historical relationship with their borders.
It really does. So the term itself first shows up in a 16th century oracular poem, and it's actually physically carved into a stone stele at the Bao Lam Pagoda, dating back to 1558.
Wow.
But the naming convention isn't just a label, right? It's an active geopolitical negotiation based entirely on syntax.
Right, and it comes down to a really deliberate ambiguity in word order, which is just a brilliant reflection of the region's diplomatic history.
Exactly. So if you read the 2 words using the indigenous Vietnamese grammatical structure, Vietnam translates to Viet of the South.
Which is a very clear inward-facing identifier, like this is who we are.
Right. But because of the heavy historical influence of classical Chinese on the regional elite at the time, reading those exact same 2 characters using classical Chinese syntax gives you 2 entirely different possible interpretations.
Okay, lay them out for us.
So it could mean south of the Viet, referring to a geographic zone strictly south of the ancient Yu territories in China, or it could mean the Viet people's southern country.
And as I was looking at how this played out historically, it struck me as like the 19th century equivalent of a massive corporate trademark dispute.
That is a great way to put it, actually.
Right, so in 1802, Emperor Jialong establishes the Nguyen dynasty, unifies the territory, and he sends envoys to the Qing dynasty emperor in China. And he demands the official title, King of Annam Viet.
Yeah, and the king emperor flatly rejects it.
And he rejects it because of that syntactic ambiguity we just talked about, right? Because by claiming Nam Viet, or Nanu Jialong, is essentially invoking the memory of an ancient kingdom that actually encompassed massive swaths of what is today southern China.
Specifically the Guangxi and Guangdong provinces.
Right, so he's low-key claiming Chinese territory with a name.
Precisely. From the king emperor's perspective, granting the title Nam Viet was tantamount to, legitimizing a territorial claim on sovereign Chinese land. The king court just couldn't allow an ascendant southern power to casually annex Chinese history in its official title.
That makes total sense. So what does the king emperor do?
Well, he forcefully flips the characters. He decreed that the tributary state would be recognized only as Vietnam.
Okay, so moving Nam, meaning south, to the end.
Exactly. And by doing that, the Chinese emperor intended to lock the meaning firmly into that geographical interpretation. The land strictly to the south of the Viet land. It was basically a linguistic cage meant to establish a subordinate peripheral geography.
But the brilliance here is the Vietnamese counter-interpretation.
Oh, it's so clever.
Right. They accept the flip name, Vietnam, but internally they read it through that alternative classical Chinese interpretation.
Yeah.
The Viet people's southern country.
Yes.
They took this linguistic cage designed by a superpower and they quietly unlocked it from the inside, reclaiming it as an assertion of independent sovereignty.
It's a very subtle, pragmatic subversion, and that really seems to be the defining characteristic of the culture, going all the way back to their prehistoric roots.
Oh, for sure. If you look at the Ongsun culture, which flourished around 1000 BC in the Red River Delta, their defining technological achievement tells a very similar story of sophisticated, independent development.
You're talking about the massive bronze drums.
Yes, the Ongsun bronze drums. They are absolute metallurgical marvels.
They really are. We are talking about artifacts weighing up to hundreds of pounds, cast using highly complex lost wax techniques.
And the surface of the metal is just covered in these incredibly intricate, concentric, encyclopedic carvings.
Yeah, they depict a highly organized society. You see warriors in feathered headdresses, sophisticated multi-decked boats, stilt houses, and intricate geometric representations of the sun and stars.
I found myself analyzing the geographic distribution of these drums in the source material, and it's honestly mind-blowing. They weren't just staying in the Red River Delta.
No, not at all. Archaeologists have found Ong Sun drums buried in Indonesia, Thailand, and all across Southeast Asia.
Which is why I view these drums almost as an ancient broadcast network, like ancient social media.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, because they were heavy, high-tech luxury goods, right? So they functioned as a physical broadcast of the civilization's economic surplus and their technological dominance. A local chieftain in modern-day Indonesia acquiring one of these drums was essentially plugging into the cultural and economic bandwidth of the early Vietnamese sphere of influence.
Right. It was a major projection of soft power. And the thing is, that power was driven by an agricultural engine.
Okay, how so?
Well, the surplus that allowed for the mining, the smelting, and the distribution of these bronze marvels came directly from the mastery of wet rice cultivation.
Ah, got it.
Yeah, the hydroengineering required to manage the monsoonal flooding of the Red River forced the early Vietnamese into highly organized communal labor systems. I mean, you cannot build and maintain a complex network of dikes and irrigation canals all by yourself.
Definitely not.
Right, it requires a highly structured, unified society.
And that necessity for unity is perfectly mythologized in their foundational origin story. I absolutely love this myth.
The myth of Lac Lang Quan and Ao Co.
Yes. It isn't just a fairy tale. If you look closely, it reads like a sociological blueprint for social cohesion.
It really does. Do you want to break it down?
Sure. So you have Lac Lang Quan, the national father, and he's depicted as a holy dragon of the aquatic lowlands. And then you have O Co, the national mother, who is represented by a holy bird, the Lac, and she's associated with the high mountainous regions.
Right, water and mountains.
Exactly. They marry, and they produce a sac containing 100 eggs, which hatch into 100 children.
And the sociological utility of this myth is just profound because, the geography of the region is so brutally divided between the narrow, fertile coastal plains and the dense, unforgiving highlands.
Right. It's a very stark contrast.
It is. And because of that, there is a natural evolutionary pressure for societal fragmentation. Highland tribes and lowland farmers live in entirely different ecological realities, but the myth resolves this tension.
Because the dragon and the bird eventually realize they can't live together in a single habitat, right?
Exactly. They peacefully separate. 50 children follow the mother into the mountains, and 50 follow the father to the sea.
So the myth serves as this permanent cultural adhesive.
Yeah.
It basically ensures that no matter how divergent the economic realities of a highland forager and a lowland rice farmer become, they share an unbreakable divine genetic lineage.
They are all, quite literally, children of the dragon and the fairy.
I love that. But they really needed that cultural adhesive, didn't they? Because the physical reality of their borders was about to be violently erased.
Yes, moving forward to 111 BC, the expanding Han dynasty of China annexed the northern and central territories, and this is the beginning of a millennium of Chinese rule.
1,000 years. That is a massive block of time.
It is. And the Han administration didn't just extract resources. They attempted to fundamentally overwrite the culture. They imposed a strict bureaucratic civil service system, they imported Mahayana Buddhism, and they deeply ingrained the hierarchical social ethics of Confucianism.
But, looking at the historical record, it's pretty clear the assimilation never truly took hold at the grassroots level.
No, it didn't. The Chinese administrative apparatus was definitely overlaid onto the society, but beneath the surface, that indigenous village-level structure we talked about, the descendants of the dragon and the fairy, it remained intact.
The resistance was just constant. And what fascinates me is the gender dynamic of that early resistance.
Well, this is a crucial point.
Right. Because in a deeply patriarchal Confucian system imposed by the Han, the most iconic, terrifying threats to Chinese hegemony were Vietnamese women.
Yes, the Trung sisters in 40 AD and Lady Trieu in 248 AD are monumental figures in the national ethos.
And the fact that these massive organized military rebellions were led by women highlights a severe structural friction, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It shows the friction between the indigenous Southeast Asian culture, which historically afforded women significantly higher social and economic standing, and the rigid, male-dominated Confucian hierarchy of the occupying empire.
And while these rebellions were ultimately crushed by massive Chinese expeditionary forces, they cemented a psychological precedent.
Right. Occupation was temporary, and resistance was a permanent moral obligation.
And that moral obligation finally materializes into a permanent strategic victory in 938 AD.
The Battle of Bokjong River.
Yes, and this isn't just a date on a timeline. It is an absolute masterclass in asymmetric warfare and applied hydroengineering.
It really is brilliant.
So the Vietnamese forces, led by the Lord Ngo Kin, are facing the overwhelmingly superior naval armada of the Southern Han. And if they engage in a conventional naval battle in open water, they are annihilated. The math simply does not work.
It doesn't. So Ngo Kin changes the math by weaponizing the environment itself.
How does he do it?
Well, he understood the complex tidal physics of the Gulf of Tonkin much better than the invading admiral did. So before the battle, Ngo Kin ordered his troops to harvest these massive wooden poles. They tipped them with iron, and they embedded them deep into the mud of the riverbed at the mouth of the Bosgang.
Wait, so they just planted spikes underwater?
Yes, and he timed this perfectly so that during high tide, these lethal spikes were completely submerged and invisible beneath the churning water.
That is terrifying.
Oh, it gets worse for the Chinese fleet.
Hmm.
He sends out a small, highly maneuverable flotilla to harass the massive Chinese war junks, basically baiting them.
Okay, so playing a game of cat and mouse.
Exactly. The Chinese admiral, thinking he has the absolute advantage, pursues the smaller Vietnamese boats up the river. He sails his entire heavy fleet right over the hidden spikes.
Oh, man.
Then the tide begins to recede. It's an incredibly terrifying tactical trap. The water level drops rapidly, and the heavy Chinese ships are literally impaled on the iron-tipped poles.
Well,
They're completely immobilized, their hulls ripped open, turning them into sitting ducks for the Vietnamese counterattack. And that victory shattered 1,000 years of imperial rule.
it's just stunning. And it established a distinct military doctrine that really defines Vietnamese strategic thought to this day, right?
Definitely. They realized that their primary weapon against massive empires was not manpower or heavy metallurgy, but the landscape itself.
And you see this doctrine perfectly executed during the golden era of Aviet under the Tron dynasty, when they faced an existential threat from the Mongol Empire.
Yes, the Mongol invasions are the ultimate stress test of this doctrine. I mean, you have the greatest contiguous land empire in human history. The Mongols had annihilated the heavy cavalry of Europe. They conquered China. They leveled the Islamic world.
But when they pushed south into the dense, humid terrain of Aviet in the 13th century, their entire operational playbook just disintegrates.
It completely falls apart. The Mongol war machine was predicated on speed, massive cavalry flanking maneuvers, and the devastating power of the composite bow.
Right, but in the muddy, densely forested, river-laced terrain of Aviet, heavy cavalry is useless.
Completely useless, and the intense humidity of the jungle literally caused the glue in the Mongol composite bows to delaminate, rendering their primary weapon completely ineffective.
That is such a wild detail.
Yeah.
The weather literally melted their weapons.
Yeah. Furthermore, the Vietnamese generals, like the legendary Tron Hung Ao, they just refused to offer the Mongols a pitched battle. They utilized scorched earth tactics, they evacuated cities, burned their own crops, and retreated into the highlands.
So you essentially starve out a nomadic steppe army in a tropical jungle.
Exactly. The Mongols outran their supply lines, they contracted tropical diseases they had no immunity to, and they were subjected to relentless guerrilla ambushes.
And then, when the Mongols finally realize they have to withdraw, what happens?
The Vietnamese ambushed their retreating fleets. And incredibly, they used the exact same iron spike tidal trap at the Bac Dong River again in 1288.
That is just a stunning repetition of tactical genius. They use the same trick hundreds of years later.
If it's not broke, don't fix it. But, the resilience of Viet wasn't purely defensive either.
Right.
As they secured their northern border against the Chinese and the Mongols, they initiated a massive centuries-long demographic and military expansion known as the Nam Tien, or the Southward March.
Yeah, starting in the 11th century and continuing through the 18th, the Vietnamese state systematically pushed south. They slowly conquered and absorbed the ancient, highly sophisticated kingdom of Champa in the central region, and eventually took vast tracts of the Khmer Kingdom in the Mekong Delta.
And I really want to analyze the mechanics of this Nam Tien, because it's easy to look at a map, see a country expanding its borders southward over several centuries, and immediately equate it to the American concept of manifest destiny.
I was actually just thinking about that analogy, but digging into the sources, that analogy falls apart pretty quickly, doesn't it?
It really does. Manifest destiny was ideologically framed as taming an empty wilderness. The Vietnamese, however, were marching into dense, ancient civilizations. They weren't just displacing people, they were actively absorbing the technological and cultural software of the people they conquered.
And that absorption is the key to understanding the regional identities within modern Vietnam, isn't it?
Absolutely. The Champa were a maritime, Hindu-influenced civilization. They had incredible expertise in deep water sailing, intricate brick temple architecture, and drought-resistant agriculture.
So as the Vietnamese pushed south, they didn't just burn the Champa infrastructure, they integrated it.
Exactly. They adopted Champa agricultural techniques, they intermarried, and they absorbed elements of Champa art and music.
Which fundamentally alters the cultural DNA of the nation. I mean, it explains why a single country, bound by the same borders, has such distinct regional temperaments.
Precisely. The North remains heavily influenced by the bureaucratic Confucian elite traditions established during the Chinese occupation. But the center and the South hold deep architectural, cultural, and genetic traces of the Champa and Khmer peoples. The Nam Tien stretched the society into this long, diverse tapestry.
And that deeply complex, regionalized tapestry is exactly what the French encountered when they began their colonization in the 1850s.
Right. And French colonization fundamentally shifted the geopolitical axis of the region. They weren't an invading land army like the Han or the Mongols. They were a heavily industrialized naval power seeking resource extraction and global market dominance.
Right. And they carved the territory into three distinct administrative regions: Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochin in the south.
Actively exploiting regional divisions to prevent unified resistance?
The economic restructuring under French Indochina was just brutal. I mean, the sources detail the establishment of massive rubber plantations, heavily funded by companies like Michelin, which relied on the forced labor of Vietnamese peasants under horrifying conditions.
It was essentially indentured servitude.
Yeah, and the French dismantled the traditional village economies, they imposed crippling taxation, and they monopolized the salt, alcohol, and opium trades to fund their colonial apparatus. But paradoxically, in order to run this massive extractive bureaucracy, the French needed a class of educated local administrators.
And this is the supreme irony of the colonial project. The French introduced a Western-style system of modern education, teaching the Vietnamese elite the philosophies of the French Enlightenment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they unwittingly handed a generation of brilliant Vietnamese intellectuals the ideological vocabulary of liberty, equality, and national self-determination. They basically trained the very minds that would eventually dismantle their empire.
And that ideological spark ignites in the aftermath of World War II.
Right.
The Japanese had occupied the region, displacing the French. But when the Japanese Empire collapses in 1945, there was a sudden, massive power vacuum.
And that's when a coalition front called the Viet Minh, led by the communist revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, launches the August Revolution, seizes control of Hanoi, and declares the independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
But the French, backed by their Western allies, returned to reassert colonial control, which triggers the First Indochina War.
And it was a grueling 8-year conflict. The Viet Minh, utilizing the deeply ingrained doctrines of asymmetric warfare, guerrilla logistics, and the weaponization of the rugged terrain, slowly ground down the modern French military.
Which culminated in the devastating siege of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, right? Where Vietnamese artillery, which was painstakingly hauled up sheer mountain faces by human labor, rained down on the trapped French garrison.
Yeah, effectively ending the French Empire in Asia.
But the victory was immediately compromised by global geopolitics. The 1954 Geneva Accords didn't unify the country. They partitioned it at the 17th parallel.
Leaving a communist government in the north and an anti-communist government in the south.
And this division becomes the flashpoint for one of the most devastating proxy conflicts of the Cold War.
Wow.
Now, I want to pause here and say to you, the listener, looking at the strategic mapping provided in our sources, we are just impartially mapping the historical landscape here without taking sides.
Exactly. We're strictly analyzing the geopolitical math.
Right. So the math is stark. North Vietnam, seeking to reunify the country by force, receives massive logistical and military backing from the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam, desperate to maintain its separate capitalist state, receives extensive military intervention and ground troops from the United States.
And the resulting conflict, known globally as the Vietnam War and locally as the Resistance War against America, was an absolute crucible. We see the deployment of staggering levels of industrial military power against an agrarian society.
Yeah, the strategic bombing campaigns dropped more tonnage of explosives on the region than was used in all theaters of World War II combined.
It's hard to even conceptualize that level of destruction. And beyond the sheer kinetic destruction, the chemical legacy of the war is something the land and the people are still actively processing.
The sources dedicate significant analysis to the impact of Agent Orange, and the strategic logic behind it was brutal. The U.S. military sought to strip away the dense jungle canopy that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were using for cover and logistics.
But the herbicide they used contained highly toxic dioxin compounds, and the biological half-life of dioxin is just devastating.
Right, because it doesn't just defoliate trees.
No, it infiltrates the soil, the water table, and the human genome. Nearly 4.8 million Vietnamese people were exposed to it, resulting in cascading generations of severe birth defects, neurological disorders, and cancers.
It's just a staggering legacy.
Yeah.
And when the war finally ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the reunification of the country under the Communist Party of Vietnam, the nation inherited a poisoned landscape, a decimated infrastructure, and a profoundly traumatized population.
And they faced this monumental recovery in near-total international isolation.
Yeah, the United States imposed a punishing trade embargo, and then border conflicts with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and a brief border war with China in 1979 drained whatever resources the state had left.
Exactly. And the Communist Party attempted to implement a strict Soviet-style planned economy. They collectivized agriculture and nationalized industry.
And what was the result?
Complete economic stagnation. The country couldn't produce enough rice to feed its own population.
Which necessitates one of the most remarkable high-wire political maneuvers in modern history. Here's where it gets really interesting. By 1986, facing hyperinflation and the threat of widespread famine, the reformist faction within the Communist Party, led by figures like Nguyen Van Linh, initiated a sweeping policy called Oi Moi.
Which translates to renovation.
Right. They looked at the collapsing Soviet model and realized that to survive, they had to entirely rewrite their economic software while maintaining their political hardware.
And I really want to unpack the friction of this transition. It is incredibly rare for an entrenched political apparatus to voluntarily loosen its grip on the economy without a violent revolution.
Yeah, it's wild. The government essentially decreed that they would remain a unitary, single-party communist state, but they would transition the economy to a socialist-oriented market economy.
It's a massive contradiction on paper.
It's like discovering your cargo ship is sinking, and deciding the solution is to instantly retrofit it into a high-speed hydrofoil while still at sea without changing the captain.
That's a perfect analogy, and the friction within the party was intense. Conservative elements feared that relinquishing central planning would inevitably lead to the collapse of socialist ideology and party control.
Naturally.
But the reformists argued pragmatically that a bankrupt, starving state was a far greater threat to national security. So They cautiously dismantled the agricultural collectives. They began issuing land use rights to individual farming households.
Okay, wait. They didn't privatize the land, right? The
Yeah,
state technically still owned it all.
correct. But they gave families the legal right to farm a specific plot and, crucially, to sell their surplus on the open market.
I was reading about this process, and I have to push back a bit on the historical narrative that this was just a flawless utopian rollout of equitable land distribution. I mean, a country transitioning out of deep poverty and strict quotas doesn't just hand out land deeds without friction. Wasn't there immense corruption or at least massive logistical chaos in deciding who got what parcel of land?
Oh, your skepticism is entirely warranted. It was an incredibly messy, contentious process. The implementation of the 1993 Land Law, which formalized these red books, the certificates of land use rights, was fraught with local disputes.
My match.
However, compared to the sweeping privatization we saw in post-Soviet Russia, which created instant oligarchs, or the massive historical latifundias of Latin America, the Vietnamese distribution was structurally decentralized. Because the primary unit of distribution was the existing rural household, the immediate result was a massive decentralized injection of incentive into the agricultural base.
And the economic concept driving the subsequent boom is fascinating. The sources point to the vent for surplus theory. Essentially, Vietnam had a massive pool of underutilized land and a highly disciplined, vastly underemployed labor force. During the era of collectivization, the incentive to produce was zero. But the moment you remove the domestic price controls and allow those farmers to access the global market, that suppressed energy violently vents outward in the form of massive agricultural yields.
It was an overnight agrarian explosion. I mean, by the 1990s, Vietnam's GDP was growing at around 8% annually. They went from importing rice to becoming the second largest exporter of rice in the world.
Wow.
And they didn't just stick to subsistence crops, they aggressively targeted high-value global commodities.
This is where the statistics become almost surreal. Vietnam is currently the world's #1 exporter of cashew nuts. They control roughly a third of the entire global market.
And processing cashews is incredibly labor-intensive and technically difficult.
Because the shell contains a toxic, caustic resin. Right?
Yes. But the Vietnamese optimized the supply chain, imported raw nuts from Africa to supplement their own massive crops, and just dominated the processing technology. They are also the #1 global exporter of black pepper and a massive force in the coffee market, specifically Robusta beans. So the next time you eat a cashew or grind pepper onto your food, there's a massive chance it came from Vietnam.
That's crazy to think about.
And the agricultural sector acted as the massive flywheel that accumulated the capital necessary to begin industrializing. Once the agrarian base was stable, the state aggressively courted foreign direct investment. They leveraged their highly literate, comparatively inexpensive labor force to attract global manufacturing giants.
And today, the economy is rapidly ascending the value chain. They're shifting from assembling textiles and footwear to high-tech electronics, semiconductors, and information technology.
Yeah, you look at the skyline of Ho Chi Minh City today, and it is a visual manifestation of this extreme wealth accumulation. You have the landmark 81 skyscraper, which is this 81-story glass and steel monolith towering over the city, surrounded by luxury shopping malls and a rapidly expanding upper middle class.
It perfectly illustrates The Economist magazine's brilliant characterization of the government as ardently capitalist communists.
Yes, but, operating as capitalist communists requires navigating an incredibly treacherous geopolitical environment. To maintain this immense economic engine, Vietnam requires open sea lanes, foreign capital, and absolute national security.
And they manage this through a highly calibrated foreign policy framework known officially as bamboo diplomacy.
I love this metaphor.
Right. Strong, deeply embedded roots representing core national interests and independence, but highly flexible branches capable of bending to whichever geopolitical wind is blowing without ever snapping.
Exactly. And the most complex wind they are navigating right now is the dynamic in the South China Sea, or as it's known locally, the East Sea.
Right. Because China is Vietnam's largest trading partner, and their economies are deeply intertwined.
However, China's expansive territorial claims in the maritime region directly threaten Vietnam's sovereign waters and their massive offshore oil and gas reserves.
So how do you balance an existential military threat from your primary economic partner?
By bending the bamboo toward your former enemy. The diplomatic rapprochement between Vietnam and the United States over the last 2 decades is staggering. You have U.S. aircraft carriers making historic port calls in Da Nang. The two nations have elevated their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership.
It is pure, unsentimental pragmatism. Vietnam utilizes closer security and economic ties with the United States, Japan, and India as a strategic counterbalance against Chinese hegemony.
Mm.
Simultaneously, they maintain legacy military procurement ties with Russia.
Right. They explicitly operate on a policy of four no's.
What are those?
No military alliances, no aligning with one country against another, no foreign military bases on Vietnamese soil, and no using force in international relations.
It is a masterclass in non-aligned sovereignty.
It really is.
And speaking of healing those historical wounds with former enemies, we have to look at the joint environmental remediation efforts happening right now. Decades after the chemical devastation of Agent Orange, the United States and Vietnam, along with international partners, are working collaboratively to literally cleanse the soil.
Yeah, the sources highlight a specific project at the Bien Hoa Air Base involving the Japanese engineering group Shimizu Corporation.
And the technology involved is a fascinating example of modern environmental engineering, because you can't just dig up dioxin-contaminated soil and move it, right?
No, you have to fundamentally break the molecular bonds of the toxin. So the Shimizu Corporation project involves building a massive on-site thermal desorption plant. They excavate the contaminated soil, place it in these massive sealed kilns, and heat it to hundreds of degrees Celsius.
Wow.
The intense heat volatilizes the dioxin, separating it from the soil, after which the toxic gas is captured and neutralized, leaving the soil clean and biologically safe to return to the earth.
It's a profound operational metaphor for the country itself, honestly. Applying immense heat and pressure to extract the poison of the past, leaving behind a foundation that can sustain future growth.
That's a really beautiful way to look at it.
But, as they secure their geopolitics and remediate the scars of the 20th century, they are slamming headfirst into the existential crisis of the 21st century, geography and climate change.
Yeah, and to understand the vulnerability, you have to visualize the topography. Vietnam is an elongated, S-shaped curve. 2/3 of the country is covered by dense, rugged mountains and tropical forests anchored by the Annamite Range.
Right.
But the vast majority of the population and the entirety of the agricultural engine is concentrated in the two massive flat river deltas. The Red River Delta in the north and the sprawling Mekong Delta in the south.
And the geology of these deltas is incredibly dynamic. The Red River, for instance, carries millions of tons of reddish-brown silt down from the highlands. As the river slows upon meeting the Gulf of Tonkin, it deposits this sediment.
And the sheer volume of this deposition means the delta is physically advancing into the sea by 60 to 80 meters every single year.
The country is literally constructing new landmass organically.
Exactly. But that same geographic reliance on low-lying water-bound deltas makes them acutely vulnerable. The sources note that approximately 55% of the population lives in low-elevation coastal zones.
That is over half the country.
Yeah. And the Mekong Delta is currently facing a slow-motion catastrophe. Upstream dam construction in neighboring countries is choking off the flow of fresh water and essential sediment. Simultaneously, rising global sea levels are pushing the ocean further inland.
And the mechanics of saltwater intrusion are terrifying for an agrarian economy. When the freshwater pressure of the river drops, the tidal force of the ocean pushes highly saline water deep into the intricate canal systems of the delta.
Which is devastating.
Right, because rice paddies and fruit orchards have a very low tolerance for salinity. When salt water breaches the water table, it effectively sterilizes the soil, devastating the exact agricultural surplus that fueled the Omi miracle in the first place.
And this rapid ecological shift, combined with aggressive industrial expansion, threatens one of the most unique biological profiles on the planet.
Because Vietnam sits at the crossroads of several biogeographical zones within the Indo-Malayan realm, right?
Yes, and it features extreme topographical isolation in its mountain ranges, so it possesses a massive rate of endemism. It's home to roughly 16% of the world's recorded species.
And the evolutionary biology at play in those isolated mountain valleys is wild. You have species like the Tonkin snub-nosed monkey and the deeply elusive saola, an incredibly rare forest-dwelling bovine, often referred to as the Asian unicorn.
But as the economy superheats, the pressure on these habitats is immense. And it's not just habitat loss from logging or agriculture. The wildlife faces a highly organized, economically driven poaching crisis.
Yet the economics of the illegal wildlife trade are deeply tied to the rise of new wealth.
Historically, certain animal parts were used in traditional medicine. However, modern poaching, particularly for items like rhinoceros horn, is largely driven by a demand for high-end status symbols among the newly affluent.
And tragically, this exact economic pressure led to the local extinction of the Javan rhinoceros in Vietnam in 2010, when the last known individual in the wild was found shot by poachers.
Which forces a really uncomfortable calculation for the government.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. How do you aggressively police deep jungle poaching syndicates and preserve massive tracts of pristine forest when you are simultaneously trying to maintain an 8% GDP growth rate to pull your remaining rural population out of poverty?
It requires a fundamental shift in cultural consciousness, and that is precisely what is happening at the grassroots level. The sources indicate a powerful rise in domestic, youth-led environmental NGOs, such as Education for Nature Vietnam and Green Viet.
Oh, that's encouraging.
It is. They understand that you cannot simply arrest your way out of a poaching crisis. You have to destroy the demand. They launch aggressive, psychologically targeted public awareness campaigns to de-glamorize the consumption of wildlife, shifting the cultural perception of rhino horn from a symbol of wealth to a symbol of ecological vandalism.
That generational shift in mindset brings us perfectly to the cultural landscape, the 102 million people living within this S-curve. The demographic data shows a nation in the midst of massive internal migration. Millions of young people are leaving the agrarian countryside, migrating to the towering apartment complexes and high-tech manufacturing hubs of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City.
And to understand the psychological weight of that urbanization, you have to understand the foundational unit of Vietnamese society,
Yeah.
the Lang, or the traditional village.
Right.
For centuries, the village was an autonomous universe. It had its own communal house, the din, its own distinct customs, and its own ancestral lands. The village provided an unbreakable social safety net and a deep sense of identity. Moving into a concrete high-rise fundamentally severs the physical connection to that communal architecture.
But looking at the sociological analysis, it seems that physical displacement doesn't erase the psychological programming. The deep emphasis on family hierarchy, communal obligation, and ancestral reverence simply adapts to the urban environment.
And that resilience stems from their deeply syncretic religious and philosophical worldview. It's an incredibly fluid synthesis of beliefs.
Yeah, Vietnam is deeply embedded in the cultural sinosphere. Despite the history of resistance against Chinese occupation, they fully internalized the philosophical architecture of Confucianism. It heavily emphasizes duty, filial piety, and a profound pursuit of harmony, or Hoa.
But they didn't adopt it rigidly. They seamlessly wove this Confucian emphasis on social order with imported Mahayana Buddhism and overlaid both of them onto indigenous ancient animist traditions like the worship of mountain spirits and intense ancestral veneration.
And the complexity doesn't stop there. Thanks to the legacy of European missionaries and the French colonial period, there is a massive, deeply rooted Catholic population.
Right?
More recently, Protestantism has become the fastest-growing religion in the country, finding massive resonance, particularly among the highland ethnic minority groups, like the Montagnard peoples, who maintain their own distinct languages and cultural practices outside the dominant Kin majority.
That philosophical pursuit of harmony, that blending of seemingly disparate elements into a unified whole, is perhaps most visceral and accessible in their culinary traditions.
Oh, the food, yes.
Vietnamese cuisine is globally renowned not just for its flavor, but for its strict underlying biochemical and philosophical architecture. It is built entirely around the concept of the Yung Phi, the 5 fundamental taste elements, which correspond to the 5 natural elements of traditional philosophy.
I found this breakdown absolutely fascinating. You have spicy, which represents the element of metal. You have sour, representing wood. Salty represents water. Bitter corresponds to fire. And sweet grounds the dish as earth.
Yes.
So eating a traditional Vietnamese meal is literally an act of philosophical balance. You're consuming metal, wood, water, fire, and earth.
It is culinary engineering. The objective of any dish, or a family-style spread of dishes, is to achieve perfect equilibrium among these elements, ensuring that no single flavor completely overpowers the others.
That makes total sense.
Furthermore, the cuisine relies heavily on massive amounts of fresh herbs, lemongrass, mint, cilantro, and Thai basil, and minimal use of heavy oils or dairy, resulting in an incredibly bright, complex, and healthy flavor profile.
But the execution of those 5 elements changes dramatically depending on where you are on the map. I was looking at the regional variations, and I noticed that northern cuisine leans heavily on black pepper for its heat, whereas the center and south utilize aggressive amounts of fiery chili peppers. I have to assume this isn't just a cultural preference, but a strict limitation of the environment, right? The north has a cooler climate with 4 distinct seasons, which historically would severely limit the cultivation of capsaicin-producing chili peppers.
That is an excellent deduction. The climate dictates the agricultural yield, which dictates the palate. Because the North couldn't reliably grow chilies historically, they relied on black pepper and subtle fermentation techniques to achieve their flavor profiles.
Ah, okay.
As a result, northern dishes like the incredibly famous pho noodle soup or the delicate steamed rice rolls known as bangkun tend to be more nuanced, balanced, and perhaps more formally structured.
And then you move down to the tropical, sun-drenched south, where the growing season is year-round. The cuisine explodes with sweetness, intense chili heat, and massive utilization of coconut milk and palm sugar. It's a louder, more vibrant culinary expression.
But regardless of the region, the culinary culture is deeply communal. The street food scene, sitting on a tiny plastic stool on a bustling sidewalk, eating a perfectly constructed bowl of buncha, or drinking a profoundly rich coffee tring, the iconic egg coffee that whips egg yolks and condensed milk into a custard-like foam over intense Robusta espresso, that is the beating heart of the daily culture.
Yet for all the modern hustle of the street food scenes and the hyper-urbanization, the entire nation is still tethered to the ancient rhythms of the lunar calendar. And nothing demonstrates this tension between the modern economic machine and the traditional village soul, quite like Tut Guinan, the Lunar New Year.
The logistics of Tut are mind-boggling. You essentially have a modern, highly industrialized nation of 102 million people collectively deciding to hit the pause button.
It's unbelievable.
The factories shut down, the financial markets close, and millions of urban migrants pack onto trains, buses, and endless streams of motorbikes to make the arduous journey from the megacities back to their ancestral land.
It is the ultimate cultural reset. Tut is fundamentally about honoring the ancestors and ensuring the harmony of the coming year. Families meticulously clean their homes to sweep away the bad luck of the past year.
Right, they prepare deeply symbolic foods, like the ban shung, a perfectly square, dense cake of sticky rice, mung bean, and pork wrapped in green leaves, which physically represents the earth. It is a moment of profound national introspection.
But the moment the holiday ends, that massive energy vents right back into the modern world. The youth culture is incredibly vibrant. You have the explosion of V-pop, which seamlessly integrates global electronic and hip-hop trends with traditional instrumentation.
And you have a massive national obsession with football. When the national team secures a victory in a major tournament, the streets of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City literally flood with millions of fans on motorbikes, waving the red flag with the golden star in a visceral, euphoric display of collective identity.
It is a nation operating at maximum velocity, fueled by an incredibly young, highly educated, and relentlessly optimistic demographic. They have deeply internalized the lessons of their history, the patience of the Bakshinang River, the tactical adaptability against the Mongols, the ideological resilience of the 20th century, and they have successfully translated that martial doctrine into a massive engine for global economic competition.
Which brings us to a close on this incredibly vast terrain. We've traced the architecture of a nation from the intricate carvings of the ancient bronze drums through a millennium of dynastic struggles and the tactical mastery of its generals. We've mapped the devastating crucible of its modern wars, the chemical legacy it is actively healing, and the stunning high-wire political act of Oimo that dropped a globalized market engine into a communist framework.
And the reason we've unpacked all these mechanisms today is to demonstrate that Vietnam is not simply a passive subject of history or a static backdrop for 20th century geopolitics.
Exactly.
It is a masterclass in profound adaptability. Whether you are analyzing global supply chains, studying the physics of climate change mitigation in river deltas, or simply seeking to understand how a society maintains its cultural soul while radically rewriting its economic reality, the mechanics of Vietnam's resilience are essential, living blueprints.
Which leaves us with a final, highly complex equation to ponder as we wrap up. We have mapped the profound strength of the bamboo diplomacy and the sheer force of the Nam Tien. But as the ascending dragon continues its explosive urbanization, creating vast new wealth and towering skylines, it faces an opponent that cannot be defeated by asymmetric warfare or political reform. the changing climate of the planet itself. As the sea levels threaten the very deltas that feed the economic machine, and the demands of modernization clash against the survival of its ancient biodiversity, will Vietnam be able to engineer a new doctrine of survival?
Can they balance the hypercapitalist future with the harmony of the ancient village? It is the ultimate test of their historical resilience, and something the entire world will be watching closely. Thank you for diving deep with us into the source material today. Stay intensely curious, and we will catch you next time.